Okay, well, we will get started. Welcome everybody to this webinar. Um, First of all, I'd like to say this is the next installment of the Daniel and Marissa class lecture series on anti-Semitism. Today we have the enormous pleasure of welcoming Izabela Tabarovskaya. Before that, I'd like to just say thank you, a special thank you to Daniel and Marissa class for their generous support of this lecture series. The class's generosity over the next 4 years will enable the USC Shoah Foundation to showcase leading scholars who will guide the audience through their latest research and explore a variety of approaches to understand and combat anti-Semitism. We truly appreciate their generosity. Today, we are honored to have with us Izabela Tabarovskaya, who is a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. She's a senior advisor with the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, a fellow with the ISGAP, that's the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, as well as the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. She's also a contributing editor to the online magazine Tablet. Her writings are featured in many other publications, including Fathom, Sapir, Quillette, and Newsweek, among others, as well as several essay collections, including 2023's Jewish Priorities, 65 Proposals for the Future of Our People, The Rebirth of Anti-Semitism in the 21st Century, from the academic boycott campaign to the mainstream, and Mapping the New Left Anti-Semitism, the Fathom essays. Her research expertise also includes politics of historical memory, should I say, Russia's independent media, the Holocaust and Stalin's repressions. Follow her on X, where she is a regular commentator on the Russian-Ukraine war, October the 7th and its aftermath, and her handle is at Iza Tabaro, Izatabaro. Izabela, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a really pleasure and an honor to be here and to be speaking here. So, Soviet anti-Semitism is a vast topic, and today I'll be speaking specifically about Soviet anti-Zionism and comparing it to what we're seeing today in some ways. Now, why do I research and speak and write about this topic? My interest sort of began a few years ago, I think around 2017 or so, when I first noticed the way in which contemporary rhetoric on college campuses corresponds to something that I knew from growing up in the USSR back in the 70s and 80s. So the rhetoric with regards to Israel, with regards to Zionism, you take the whole vocabulary, Zionism is racism, or, Israelis are doing to Palestinians what the Nazis did to Jews. All of it, Israel is an apartheid state, all of it was really familiar to me. And so that kind of piqued my interest. And I began studying it and researching it and published quite a lot about it by the time October 7th happened. And when October 7th happened, that really brought all of it into really stark relief. I mean, that's when the comparisons between Gaza and the Warsaw Ghetto kind of burst into the mainstream. Not that they weren't there before. They had been there before. They had been there for years. Also in Soviet literature, going back to the 60s and 70s. But after October 7th, all of a sudden, people were making it loud and clear and really, and comparing Hamas with freedom fighters. And also, this is something that we also see in Soviet literature. The notion that Israel is conducting a genocide in Gaza, same thing, you see throughout Soviet literature, for 25 years, starting with 1967 or even before. And I'll talk about the significance of 67. And so I think that, October 7th made it impossible not to notice this rhetoric. And a lot of people noticed, and they've tried to figure out, we're all trying to figure out, where is this coming from? And most people are zeroing in, a lot of people are zeroing in on the critical theory impact, on kind of that postmodern wave and how they changed the views and the ways of thinking and shifted the focus of portions of the left. And I think it's really important. I think it plays a very important role. But what it doesn't help us understand, I think it helps us understand how Jews suddenly in this universe become the oppressors, right? How, and it's clear how from there you get to anti-Semitism. So it's not inherently anti-Semitic, but once you put Jews in the category of oppressors officially, then you are just a step away from that. But it doesn't help us understand the obsession with Israel and Zionism, and it doesn't help us understand the specific use of this specific rhetoric, because truly the left today reproduces with just stark fidelity the tropes, the motifs, the slogans, the explanatory logic, the entire stories from Soviet propaganda. They don't know it. I have absolutely no doubt about it. It's 100%. They don't know it. But, you know, you don't just recreate such a volume of vocabulary and concepts without some chain of transmission. You know, I mean, to say that they reinvented all of it would be like imagining that you can sit down at a computer and accidentally reproduce Anna Karenina or War and Peace, right, without consulting with the original or with ChatGPT. So there is some form of transmission going on. So that had happened at some point. That was my that's my working hypothesis, and it already became clear to me even before October 7th, and now I'm even more certain about it. So let's get, you know, we're lucky today to have an hour and a half for our seminar. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, but because we do have this time, I get to actually present this history in more detail than I often can otherwise. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Show. All right. So I want to start by showing you two slides. So slide number 1 is a cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a French edition, 1920s or so. And I probably, for this crowd, I probably don't need to explain what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are. I'll just say that it's the most influential piece of writing ever produced, anti-Semitic piece of writing. It really represents kind of the essence of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which is important, right? The fact that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, right? Aside from other qualities that we assign to it. And the protocols, of course, played a very important, crucial role in the formulation, in Nazi thinking and in Nazi propaganda. They didn't view it as a recording of some, I don't believe that they believed what the protocols claim, that they are a kind of a recording or a transcript of a meeting of the elders of Zion who are planning how to dominate the world. But they proved to be extremely useful in the propaganda, right? The idea that there are evil Jews manipulating the world. And what you have here, what's really important here is, or what's interesting for our purposes, is you have kind of this classic anti-Semitic representation of a Jew. We know it's a Jew because of the Jewish features, of course, just the image, aside from the title tells us that it's about Jews. It's simultaneously subhuman and super powerful, right? This Jew as a spider holding the world in its tentacles. And it's a Bolshevik Jew. We know it because there is a 5-pointed star on its military cap. And so that's the image in the 1920s of this scary Jew, right? There's a fear at the time that the Bolshevism that's supposedly run by Jews is going to sweep Europe, okay? So now the Bolsheviks prohibited this kind of propaganda. The protocols, of course, first appeared in the Russian Empire. They were kind of central to along with other pogromist literature, to the pogroms that were happening in the run-up to the revolution. And so, you know, when the Bolsheviks come to power, one of the things they do is they prohibit anti-Semitic propaganda because, you know, they in general prohibit discrimination on the basis of racial discrimination or religious discrimination. And they view, Lenin views, we'll get to that in a moment, but Lenin views anti-Semitism as a kind of as something that only happens in a reactionary regime like the Tsarist regime. He believes that socialism will do away with anti-Semitism anyway. So this literature is prohibited. This kind of thinking is prohibited. Certainly the pogroms are prohibited. And in fact, we have to give credit where credit is due. The Bolsheviks do put an end to the practice of physical annihilation of Jews. So given what I just said, given that it was prohibited in the USSR, how come we see the image that I'm going to show you next? And this image is it appears in 1971 or 1972 at a May Day parade in Moscow. So you have basically, let me see if I have them side by side. Yes, I have them side by side. So you can actually see that this is basically the same image. And I often say that if you don't know French or if you don't know Russian, you're actually at an advantage here because you're not distracted by the words. You really see that it's the same image. It's a Jew holding the world in its tentacles, right? And you see there is kind of the military element, except that on the left is the Bolshevik star, on the right it's a six-pointed star. So why are we seeing it? And the reason we're seeing it is precisely the words. So the words on the left say the Jewish danger, and the words on the right say Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. So what the Soviet propagandists are telling us, and of course, May Day parade, the only, in any case in the USSR at the time, I say it because I realized at some point that people don't realize it, that the only kind of displays of this nature, external displays, could be produced by the state. It wasn't some group that produced it separately and displayed it in the parade. This was a state-sanctioned production. The slogans for all of the parades were approved at the highest level. So Zionism is a weapon of imperialism is a central slogan in the early 1970s for the Soviet regime, enough to put it at the heart of its demonstration on May 1st. So clearly words play a role, but images are the same. And so I think all of us can see that it's the same image. But the Soviets deny that it's the same. And of course, they deny that they're being anti-Semitic in the same way that we're hearing it denied today. They say that they're just being anti-Zionist. They're not being anti-Semitic, while using the same kind of visual ideas. Okay, so why are we talking about this? Why, let me just say once again why it's important to understand this history. I actually think that it's impossible to understand what we're seeing today without understanding this line of transmission. Because if we don't understand this, or this origin, if we don't understand this origin, then we may fall victim to a number of misconceptions. So misconception number one is that what we're dealing with today is new anti-Semitism, right? We talk about how anti-Zionism is a new anti-Semitism. I think after October 7th, I no longer have to really actually prove to people that anti-Zionism very easily converts into anti-Semitism. But for a while, it was hard for people to comprehend it. But this is something, there's nothing actually new to it. Generations of Soviet Jews experience precisely the kind of what happens when major institutions or major kind of, when a society assumes anti-Zionist language, anti-Zionist dogmas, anti-Zionist logic. Soviet Jews knew very well what happens to them. And in many ways, it's actually some of the things that have been happening to American Jews already now for several years, right? A reduction of certain professional opportunities, a reduction of certain educational opportunities. So it's important to understand that there is a precursor to this. If we don't understand this history, we might also think that the language we're hearing today is perhaps a product of activism, right? Social justice activism. It's a bunch of activists in Berkeley who got together and came up with the idea that Zionism is racism. And that is not the case. What we're dealing with is we're dealing with very sophisticated propaganda put together by really masters of propaganda and active measures. And it helps us to set up expectations correctly. I'll tell you, perhaps to preclude questions that might come in the end, that I'm often asked these days, well, what are some talking points that we can use? It's history, great, it's interesting, but what can we use? Give me some 3 talking points, an elevator speech to convince an Israel hater that, what Israel is doing is actually not what you say it's doing. It's not an apartheid state, And I don't think we can fight this kind of sophisticated propaganda, which has been, refined, practiced on millions of people for decades. I don't think we can expect to defeat it with better talking points. We're in a war of ideas. We have to approach it as such. And again, we have to set the expectations appropriately. Okay. And again, to kind of point out that anti-Zionism, we hear a lot that again, it's a little bit less now after October 7th, but still we hear a lot of people asking the question, is anti-Zionism the same as anti-Semitism? There's a lot of confusion around this. The confusion is there on purpose. Soviet propaganda certainly did a lot to confuse the terminology. And, in theory, my answer to this is in theory, perhaps anti-Zionism doesn't have to be anti-Semitic. But in practice, and we know it historically, in practice, again, anytime it becomes widespread in a society, it virtually always is. And the USSR and its experience of Soviet Jews is one example, and there are other examples. Einat Wilf often, she brings in other examples and talks about how in Arab societies, once they adopted an anti-Zionist stance, those societies became Jew-free. This is basically what happened to the USSR as well. As soon as the propaganda, the anti-Zionist propaganda gets going, Soviet Jews are starting to pack their bags. Now, they can't leave right away because the USSR is a closed society, but by the end of the Soviet Union, when the doors are opened, essentially the vast majority of Soviet Jews leave. So this is something that I think is important for us to understand. Okay. So now I mostly talk in my lectures and I mostly focus my research on post-1967, because I think that in my view, that is the period that's most relevant to our current moment. But Soviet anti-Zionism didn't, of course, begin with 1967. In fact, the Soviets were always anti-Zionist. The Soviets, starting with the Bolsheviks, they always viewed Zionism as a it actually starts with Stalin and Lenin. Let me see what I have here. Well, we don't need to look at it. It's okay. But it starts with really a picture. It's outlined kind of in the clearest way in an article that Stalin wrote in 1913 called Marxism and the National Question. And his ideas that he lays out in that article are very much influenced by Lenin. He lays out there why Bolsheviks don't agree with Zionists, essentially. And one of their main contentions is that Zionists are wrong by calling Jews a nation, by calling Jews kind of a single people. And they offer Marxist arguments. They say that, there's like several formal kind of characteristics of a nation that Jews don't meet at the time. They don't have a shared language. They don't have a shared territory. They don't have the shared economic activity, and they don't even have the same kind of national costume, the same culture. So based on that, they say that Zionists are wrong. And they also say that Zionists are wrong by trying to draw Jews into their little nationalist project. Jews need to be together. Because I remember that Jews of the Russian Empire are really the most oppressed group at that time, by the time, the revolution rolls around. And the Bolsheviks are very much counting on Jewish support. The Jewish poor, the Jewish workers. And so Zionists are telling Jews, look, the most important thing about our situation is that we are Jewish, and it doesn't matter. The class distinctions don't matter, right? We need to go and kind of unite ourselves as a people and rebuild our nation in Palestine. This is, of course, anathema to somebody who looks at the world through a Marxist lens and believes that the main thing that unites people is their class interests. It doesn't matter what nationality you are. So if you're a Jewish worker, if you're a Jewish proletarian, then you have more in common with German and Japanese and Argentinian and British proletariat than you have with your own national bourgeoisie. And so that is another reason that they very much oppose the Zionist project. And just simply in practical terms, they feel that Zionists are undermining the movement. So when the revolution happens, as I already mentioned, Lenin is very clear. He's against Zionism, but he's at the same time against anti-Semitism. And he views anti-Semitism again as an expression of a capitalist society, of a reactionary czarist regime. And he believes that once socialism is internationalist, and so once socialism arrives, anti-Semitism will disappear. And once the revolution happens, for the first decade after the revolution, for many Jews, this experience is actually very liberating. If they adopt those of them who adopted the position that, I'm going to stop sharing for a little bit, so those of them who adopt the deal that the Bolsheviks proposed to them, which is to join in the effort of building the first socialist state, to give up their religious dogmas and to give up their nationalism, to give up the Zionist ideas, then they will have every opportunity that everybody else has. And in fact, that happens. The Bolsheviks abolished the Pale of Settlement, and many, many Jews join professions that they had never been seen at. They occupy, all of a sudden, they are visible in managerial positions. But those Jews who don't want to give up their religious beliefs, and those Jews who don't want to give up their Zionist beliefs, they experience repressions and they suffer. And so in that sense, sometimes people will say, well, the Bolsheviks were in fact, not, and they were not anti-Semitic. It's actually inaccurate to say it. I think the ideology truly was against anti-Semitism, but in practice, only some Jews were adopted and accepted within that. And the reason I talk about this is that I think you can actually see in some of the left-wing circles still this belief that Jews need to join in the general struggle of whatever it is that we're struggling for, right? However we define the oppressed today. Remember that the binary that everybody's talking about today, oppressed versus oppressor, it's not new either, right? So just oppressors and the categories are defined differently. So Bernie Sanders, in fact, talked about it in that opinion piece he wrote in the Jewish Currents, I think, in the run-up to the previous election, where he was trying to convince Jews to vote for him. So he was saying, Jews need to realize, I'm here to fight for you, to fight against anti-Semitism, but you need to realize that we need to join in the fight against overall oppression. And, the last time Jews did it, didn't really work out well for them, because socialism did not bring about the end of anti-Semitism. And then when Stalin comes to power, and this is kind of, this is the second period of Soviet anti-Zionism, I sort of notionally divide Soviet anti-Zionism into three periods. So you have the early on, the Bolshevik period, then you have the Stalin period, the second period. So this is when Soviet anti-Zionism changes. So it changes throughout the decades, okay? So under the Bolsheviks, the Soviet anti-Zionism was still kind of, you could see how they're arguing from a place of kind of certain theoretical ideas and concepts. You don't have to agree with them, and I don't agree with them. I think it's a very narrow and very kind of tendentious view. It doesn't reflect all of reality, but you can understand where they're coming from. There is logic. They're not really arguing. They're not painting Zionism black or anything like that, right? This is their Marxist belief. Under Stalin, we start to hear, in the late Stalin period, we start to hear conspiracist notes. We start to hear anti-Zionism as a tool. There are conspiracist notes added to it. So the paradox of the Stalin period, and I'm not going to dwell too long on it, because I think that that's actually the period that's studied the best, and you can really Google and find a lot of really good stuff written about it. But the paradox there is that Stalin, of course, supported the establishment of the State of Israel, but that support was very brief. And essentially, it can be explained by the fact that Stalin viewed Israel as a kind of foothold for Soviet interests in the Middle East, as a way to oppose British interests. He was aware that a lot of the people in Israel held socialist beliefs, in fact, Stalinist beliefs. I think I'm going to share again and show you some images that I have in that regard. So so this is actually, I love this photo. So this is from, I think, also a May Day parade, but in Israel, I think in Tel Aviv. So you see, here are these Israelis who are carrying the portraits of Lenin and Stalin, and there are slogans in Hebrew. This is some of the just kind of posters, Israeli posters. So Stalin was aware of all of this, but his attitude changes very quickly. And one of the factors that contributes to it, of course, perhaps the most important factor is that he realizes that Ben-Gurion takes a clear orientation toward the United States. But then something else happens. So in 1948, it's an incident that Soviet Jews, it's legendary in the Soviet Jewish kind of collective memory. Golda Meir comes to Moscow. And here in the little circle, you can see the picture of the young Golda Meir completely swamped by Soviet Jews. She comes as, I believe, the first ambassador of the State of Israel to the USSR. Soviet Jews are absolutely ecstatic. She comes to a service in the Moscow synagogue. It's September, so it's the high holidays. I mean, Jews are literally hanging off the lamppost to see her, and they were warned not to come, and they come anyway. And this triggers the Stalin's famous paranoia. It just sort of sets off all kinds of alarms. He said, and Jews, by the way, Soviet Jews are writing to him and saying, we want to go and fight for the Jewish state, in the war that it's fighting now against the Arab regimes. And so he feels that he has a fifth column on his hands. And this is when it's like 47, 48 is when the infamous Ruthless Cosmopolitans campaign begins, when Jews are being accused of disloyalty. There are accusations of bourgeois nationalism, which is in the Jewish context is basically an accusation of Zionism, of being loyal to a foreign movement. And this is just a picture of some of the Soviet Jewish intellectuals who at the time, the last kind of the remnants of the Yiddish intelligentsia, who get killed in the what's known as the Night of the Murdered Poets. It's a misnomer because they weren't all poets at all. There were scientists there. There were, it was kind of it was a small group, but they represented a relatively broad swath of Russian Jewish intelligentsia. So they are all they're arrested and they're secretly tortured and then they're killed. Of course, the third person from the left is Solomon Michoels. He is killed in January 47. It's presented to the public as if it's an accident, but people in the know already begin to understand that it's a signal for something really terrible that's going to happen. Here's the picture of Michoels, legendary actor. We'll skip through this. And then we have the Slansky trial in Prague. I'll just show you some pictures. So this is a completely manipulated stage show trial of Czech communists, most of whom were Jewish, completely anti-Zionist, loyal communists. But this is staged in the fall of 1952. This is them just kind of trying to make a case, trying to defend themselves in vain, and it all ends with executions. And then you have in January 1953, you have the doctor's plot, the idea that the idea that there was a group of Jewish doctors who wanted to poison Soviet leadership. And in both the anti-cosmopolitan campaign and the doctor's plot story, you hear it's not only about kind of your classic anti-Semitic tropes. Sometimes people write about it and they forget to mention or they omit to mention, they omit the fact that the accusations of being loyal, of being Zionist, not bourgeois nationalist, right? And being loyal to also American intelligence services or serving as assets of foreign intelligence, of Israeli and American foreign intelligence, they're present there. So anti-Zionism is beginning to be presented here in the way that you can see this cartoon. So this is cartoon from that period. So it's a really classic anti-Semitic image, right? So the mask of a kind doctor is torn off, and behind that mask is an angry scowl of a capitalist, capitalist kind of monster. How does a Soviet citizen know that it's a capitalist monster. It's a three-piece suit. That's kind of the code kind of for that. The scowl, also the sunglasses. This is how Soviet caricaturists conveyed that we're talking about a bourgeois, right? A foreign kind of bourgeois capitalist. And you see the hands that are kind of red, that you can see that this kind of hands can strangle dear comrade Stalin, but then the strong and beautiful hand of I assume, proletarian hand is throwing them out. So this is from that period. Okay, so then of course Stalin dies in 1953. The campaign immediately stops. It immediately becomes clear that it was all invented, that it was all unproven, and so then there is a period where essentially the policy of the Soviet leadership of Khrushchev is to, well, let's just not really even touch the Jewish theme too much. Let's just not even, it's kind of let them just quietly assimilate. That's kind of the route that they take. Now, there are in the press active campaigns against Israel. In particular, during the Eichmann trial, the Soviets really hated that Israel is assuming the role of a judge over Nazi crimes, because the Soviets positioned themselves as being the only and the sole kind of, as a victor over the Nazis, and therefore the only kind of group, the only country that has the right to put Nazi criminals on trial. So there's a lot of kind of really ugly rhetoric about Israel at the time. But so I'm going to just skip through that and switch to 1967. This is when kind of the third stage of Soviet anti-Zionism appears. And this is the period when Soviet anti-Zionism really goes global. It goes fully conspiracist, and it goes fully global, because all of the previous ones, I would say, it was either contained, was contained within the Bolshevik movement. The Comintern talked about these things. Stalin's, okay, so it spread to the Czech Republic, but it really was kind of mostly contained within the USSR and perhaps the socialist bloc as it was forming. 1967 is when it really goes global. So what happens in 1967? In 1967, the USSR its Arab allies who it financed and trained lose to Israel in the Six-Day War. And that sets off a really massive crisis in Moscow. They don't understand how it is that a small country like Israel could lose to Arab armies that Soviet advisors trained and financed and armed. And they realize that it's also a massive blow to the Soviet image. And so they begin to try to kind of connect the dots. And we have to understand that Soviet political culture was anyway conspiracist, right? This is only 15 years after Stalin died. In any case, totalitarian systems produce conspiracist thinking, right? They depend on the idea that there is an external enemy or an internal enemy, and that creates kind of conspiracist language. That was all very much part of the Soviet culture, and certainly it very much existed within the KGB. And the KGB begin to look at the world, and they start to connect the dots, right? And I kind of use it in quotation marks. What do they see when they look at the world in 1967? So the Six-Day War is number one. Soviet Jews begin to demand a right to emigrate. That's number two. And that's in part happens because they're really inspired by Israel's victory in the war. All of a sudden, they realize that Jewish identity can be a source of pride and not just a source of grief and oppression and discrimination. And so many of them want to emigrate. They also see that in the United States and elsewhere, a campaign for Soviet Jewry is starting to take off. So Soviet Jews are American Jews are mobilizing, and Jews in other countries as well, but I think it really begins primarily with American Jews. They are mobilizing to free Soviet Jews. And this, the Soviets just can't tolerate. They view this as an interference in internal relations, but more importantly, they connect all of this, and they believe that there is a guiding hand behind all of it, that there is somebody guiding all of it. They see that there are so many Jews in America, that they're everywhere. There are so many organizations, Jewish organizations, and they're all pro-Israel. And there are Jews in the media, and there are Jews in the banks, and there are Jews in politics. And again, so they connect all of it together. And so they start to ask themselves, who is directing all of this? Obviously, you can't just imagine that all of these Jews in the United States simply support Israel on their own. Somebody's telling them to do it. And so they invent this entire conspiracy theory about Zionism. They position Zionism as the most dangerous ideology, along with imperialism, American imperialism. They see Zionism as both a kind of the lapdog of the United States, because they don't believe that in 67 Israel won without secret American support. And which in 67, by the way, as far as I know, there was no support from the United States, military support, just it wasn't there. And so on the one hand, it's kind of it enjoys the support of the United States. At the same time, it guides American policy, manipulates America to support it. So you start to hear the anti-Semitic tropes in that, right? Jews manipulating kind of others, manipulating the goyim, right, to support themselves, to fulfill their vision. And so essentially what happens is a group of intellectuals emerges in the Soviet Union, intellectuals, quote unquote, who produce all of the literature that the Soviets need in order to kind of flesh out this theory. So what I have on this slide is some of the literature that they produced. I'll get to some of it in English now, just so you understand the titles. Well, why don't we do that? And then we'll talk about the people who produced it. So here are the covers of some of the English language brochures that the Soviets begin to produce. So they engage their entire propaganda network, which was massive. I mean, they really had a massive propaganda apparatus that reached the entire world. And they start to produce this literature in dozens of languages, and they start to deliver it to different countries in different continents around the world via print, via radio, via other things, other kind of venues as well. The USSR organized a huge number of conferences for its left-wing supporters, where they would be adopting different resolutions, right, in support essentially of Soviet foreign policy. And after 67, the condemnation of Zionism becomes a crucial part of all of these international gatherings organized under Soviet auspices. It doesn't matter who is meeting, whether it's women, women's issues, or it's kind of student association, or it's trade unions, or meeting under Soviet auspices. They would always assume one of the lines in the resolution will be the condemnation of Zionism, the condemnation of Israel, the expression of support for the oppressed Arab peoples who are being oppressed by Zionists. So here what you have is the titles of some of the literature that they put out. It's just a small drop in the sea. But you see here, Zionism is an instrument of imperialist reaction, Zionism, a form of racism, the truth about Zionism, right? It's a very conspiracist kind of language. It very much in the kind of in the spirit of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? That what you see is not true. What the Jews tell you is not true. So what Zionists tell you is not true. Let us tell you that what's really true. Zionism counts on terror. That's another, it's also something that we see today all the time, right? That Zionists are terrorists. So that already, this I think is from 1982, this brochure. Washington and Tel Aviv against the Arabs. So again, that linkage between the United States and Israel. So Israel is not acting on its own, it's acting together with America. So because America is the main rival and the main kind of hostile entity. So the linkage happens there. So this is just another example of a Soviet publication, The Problems of Peace and Socialism. And on the right, you see that this was a publication that was produced, I believe, in like 50 languages. It was a theoretical Communist Party journal, and it was distributed again in dozens of countries in various languages. So the one on the right was called the World Marxist Review. It was the exact translation of what the Problems of Peace and Socialism produced. And if you look at it, you see how, you know, it takes the anti-Zionist stance, and that means that everybody who is part of the global communist movement adopts it as well, because they all are supposed to speak in the same language. And in fact, they do. When you look at the communist press from that time, the communist theoretical press, publications from around the world, and I've only looked at English because that's just the easiest for me, but I'm actually convinced that if you look at the communist press in Spanish and in French and in German, in every language, in Arabic, you will find the same ideas, because they all had to speak in the same language. So this is a World Marxist Review, just so you understand, was published in Canada. So this was very much, you know, it was very close to home. So what are some of the tropes of this propaganda? I mean, basically, you could say that what the Soviets did, what these ideologues did, and I will say a few more words about them in a moment, but what they did is that they were, I'll say it about them now, is that they were themselves, they spoke the kind of Marxist-Leninist language in which you had to speak in order to be useful to Soviet propaganda. But they were themselves of very far right views. Some of them were monarchists. They were sort of the match to the dissidents, the liberal Soviet dissidents that I think a lot of people have heard about, right? There were dissidents that emerge in the Khrushchev era who propose and then become more active in the 60s. So they proposed to change the USSR in the democratic image. But then you also have dissidents who emerge who are on the right, and they want for the USSR to return to monarchy. They want for the USSR to become, you know, to restore Christianity. And, you know, unfortunately, those views in the context of Russian nationalism, these are Russian nationalists, they're always associated with anti-Semitism. So these people read the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So the protocols are prohibited, but they circulate widely in certain circles. And they don't only circulate widely, by the way, on these kind of far-right dissident circles in the USSR. They also circulate widely in the Komsomol, which is the Communist Party youth movement, very, very widely. That movement at that point becomes actually very conservative. So you have a correspondence in the tropes, right? So where the protocols talk about international Jewry, Soviet propaganda talks about international Zionism as the most dangerous kind of enemy. So, you know, the protocols talk about Jews controlling the global media and world politics and the world events and corrupting the youth. And Soviet propaganda says the same about Zionists. This is one of the people, they were called Zionologists. So this is one of them. There was a group of perhaps a dozen and a half or so that gathered around and was managed by a very high-level Soviet official in the International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So just to so you understand, it's very high level. It means that they viewed the production of this anti-Zionist ideology as extremely important, as a priority for the party. And so this official gathered these Zionologists around them. This is one of the most prominent ones. This specific guy, we know 100% that he held anti-Semitic views, because a Russian historian explored some of his papers after he died, and we know that he just had some really crazy ideas what one should do with Russian Jews. I want to show you a couple of tables very quickly, because I realize we're running out of time. I want to show you an example of when you look at some of the books that these Zionologists produce, and you look at the terminology that you encounter most frequently. What are some of the most frequently encountered terms that are associated with Zionism in these books? So Fascism Under the Blue Star. So this is a book that's from I think 72 or something like that. This is kind of the classic, the most famous book by the Yevgeny Yevseyev, whose picture I just showed you, still republished in Russia, now republished by the far right. You know, just to show you, you know, this is like this emerges as a supposedly far left kind of a piece of writing and geared at the far left. But today it is reproduced by the same people in Russia who republished the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So one of the most frequent terms are the names of rich Jews or Zionists who own everything around the world. You see banker, banks, banker, imperialist, imperial, aggression, aggressive, reaction, reactionary. Like all of these terms are some of the most frequently, you see these terms mentioned most frequently in association with Zionism. Africa is here as well because a big chunk of Soviet propaganda talked about how Zionists were trying to manipulate African nations, that Zionists were against the national liberation movement, and how Israel was the equivalent of South African apartheid. And this, just so you understand, this is, you can actually see it in particular with regards to Africa. I mean, people often ask, were the Soviets doing it because they were kind of inherently anti-Semitic? And I think that some of them were. So like a person like Yevseyev most certainly was, right, the ideologue. But as a country, as a regime, I would say that they were not driven by a hatred of Jews the way, for example, the Iranian regime is driven today. I think they were driven by very pragmatic political considerations. They wanted to be the ones that have the most influence in Africa. And they hated the fact that Israel was making inroads in Africa as well. Remember that they thought that Israel was kind of the forward detachment, I guess, of American imperialism. And so that was a big part of why there was so much aggressive propaganda against Israel with regards to Africa. This is just to show you, it's from that book that we just talked about, Fascism Under the Blue Star. What this is what you see in the squares are the names, Jewish names. So you have Cohens and Goldmans and Dreyfuses and Lazars and the Rothschilds. So this scheme proposed to show how all of these rich Jews, who here are also called Zionists, are interacting with one another and how they're supporting one another. And so you have this whole, again, like the Zionist spider holding the world in its tentacles. Here's another book, Zionism as a Form of Racism and Racial Discrimination. So what are some of the terms that we encounter most frequently here associated with Zionism? So occupation, aggression, racism, terror, colonialism, intelligence, espionage, secret services, spying, right? This idea that kind of, that you can't trust Zionists, that they are always acting, it's always cloak and dagger. They are acting in concert with the CIA and MI6. There was a very big strain in Soviet propaganda from that time. Another book, again, the top, the ideology and practice of international Zionism. So the top terms are imperialism, reaction, racism, aggression, sabotage, subversion. So, imagine this, you have a flood of propaganda, all of which is, because it's directed from the center, it repeats the same messages. In articles, there are tens of thousands of articles that are produced. There are hundreds of books that are produced, again, in multiple languages. The newspapers circulate them in millions, right? It's circulations of millions. So all of this just kind of becomes part of the national fabric in the Soviet Union. And I argue that this is how it becomes part of the conventional thinking among portions of the global left in the West and also in the developing world. And in this lecture, I'm not going to be able to touch on it. I haven't yet written it up, but I've done a lot of research and looking again at what the British, some portions of the British left were publishing at the time in the 70s and 80s. And the British left is really important because actually some of the people who came out of that milieu are still very influential, like Corbyn and his advisors, like George Galloway, like Ken Livingstone. He's perhaps less important right now, but they came out of that milieu and they're still influential. Angela Davis comes out of that milieu. And if you look at what the CPUSA published at the time, this is the kind of stuff it published about Israel and Zionism. And so you begin to understand, and Angela Davis, of course, remains a big hero today among the anti-Israel left. This is the cover of a book by Mahmoud Abbas, which is based on his Soviet dissertation. By the way, you should know that today I wrote an article analyzing the summary of his dissertation, which was the only thing that was available publicly until now. this weekend, already today, an Israeli newspaper, Israel Hayom, has published an article. So apparently now somebody has made the full text of the dissertation public. So I'm going to try and get that, but hopefully we can now see the full thing. But just reading the article, I can see that, you know, my analysis of it was correct. But basically what he talks about in that dissertation, which he defended in 1982 in the USSR, is about Zionist supposed collaboration with Nazi Germany in the annihilation of Jews during the Holocaust. So, you know, this is the influence that goes from back then, and this is a person who is still very much influential in the global politics. This is just an example of an article that the Soviets managed to publish in the New York Times, which also has, it's again early, it's 1971. All of this Spartak Beglov, the New York Times introduces him as a, I don't know, political commentator from Novosti, which is the Soviet propaganda agency. But I mean, he's really a propagandist. I mean, if you follow him, as I have, you just know that he perhaps performs, he's presented as a journalist, but he performs a propaganda function for the Soviet regime. And so if you read this piece, you will see that it's filled with these ideas. Again, Zionists are like Nazis and like fascists, and they are, by the way, undermining American foreign policy interests. This is the similar campaign happens in Poland in 1967-68. So these are pictures from Poland when Polish workers, so this is also directed from Moscow, Polish demonstrators demanding that Jews be swept out of the country, that the party be cleansed of the Zionist influence, and Zionists are told to go to Palestine or to Israel. You know, I want to show you a couple of comparisons between some of the cartoons that the Soviets put out and some of the images that we see today. In the remaining, I'm going to go I'm going to go for another 7 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions. So I just want to show you the similarity between the images, which I think is important. So the image on the right is an image from a brochure. Actually, let me see, here it is. You can see it better. This is the cover of a brochure produced by the British Communist Party. So you see the intertwining of the swastika and the Star of David. The brochure is called Zionism, a racist, anti-Semitic, and reactionary tool of imperialism. I'm sure now you hear the echoes of what we were talking about before. What you see on the right here is the table from the British Communist Party that it's displayed at one of the recent demonstrations in London. And what you see on the left is a cartoon produced by the USSR in 1971, the banner of the Zionist gang, right? So the intertwining is different between the swastika and the Star of David, but the intertwining is there. This is, again, to show you that, you know, the link, you know, the equation between Zionism and Nazism. We saw it in the case of Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, but in fact, Abbas's dissertation is 1982, but you start to see it in Soviet literature already after 1967. And then on the right is a picture, again, from a recent London demonstration, Zionism is the new Nazism. Here's another example. You see it's a kind of it's a theme that's often repeated. So a Jew as a reflection of Hitler. So on the left, you have a Soviet cartoon from the 70s also, I believe. And it's, you know, I'll point out something that's interesting here, because the Soviets were very, very careful to present themselves as anti-Zionists and not anti-Semites, as not anti-Jews. So most of Soviet cartoons will in one way or another indicate that the Jew in the picture is an Israeli, you know, so he may be wearing an Israeli uniform, you know, an IDF uniform, or in some other way be associated with Israel. Here, or it may say openly that this is a Zionist, okay? So here, this cartoonist, it's a Kishinev cartoon, which I think is interesting, considering that that's where the Protocols of the Elders of Zion actually received the most kind of, they played a really crucial role in the inflaming of the feelings that led to the Kishinev pogrom. So here you have a Jew. There's no indication that this is a Zionist or an Israeli, right? This is just a truly, purely anti-Semitic image. And you see how he reflects his shadow is Hitler. The cartoon in the middle comes from the Holocaust cartoon contest that Iran organized some years back. And then on the right, you have an image, a contemporary image from post-October 7th demonstration, the irony of becoming what you hated. So now it's Netanyahu is Hitler. So these are some just more examples of the same. This is a Soviet cartoon on the left. You know, this is just to in reference to the frequent comparisons between Gaza and the Warsaw Ghetto. And I find it really interesting that, you know, there was a New Yorker article by Masha Gessen where she seemed to suggest that this ghetto comparison was something that she, or I should say they came up with on their own. But in fact, it already exists in 1967. So the Soviets here, you see here in the Soviet cartoon on the left, an Israeli soldier holding, you know, it's a picture that's filled with codes for equating the Israeli soldier with the Nazis. So he's holding a weapon that says Blitzkrieg, which of course is immediately associated with the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. There is a sign in the back that says, in Russian, it says Lebensraum. So again, it's the reason why the Nazis invade the USSR. But of course, instead of the Nazi star, or swastika, you have the Star of David. And this soldier is receiving a blueprint for Auschwitz from a Nazi ghost, right? Bloodstained instruments and a blueprint which says New Order, Model Auschwitz. So the Israeli is taking over from the Nazi. And in the back, presumably you have like a wall of the new ghetto where Palestinians will be kept. On the right, you have a contemporary cartoon. Again, it was submitted for it won the first prize in Iran's Holocaust cartoon context. It actually conveys the same idea in a simpler way visually, where the picture of Auschwitz is being superimposed on the Temple Mount. Okay, so you know, I think I'll stop here because I think I've really communicated most of what I wanted to say, and I'll stop sharing and we can just go to questions.
And thank you, Isabella, for your talk. We do have some questions. I'm gonna slightly indulge myself by asking the first couple of questions, if I may, and then we'll come to the questions that are in the Q&A. And I would encourage anyone who has questions to put them in the Q&A, and so we can ask them as well. I guess, well, I have lots of questions, but I'll try and limit myself to a couple. You've presented. I'm wondering whether it's possible to also unpick kind of the influence of Soviet propaganda from the left. I mean, and this may be part of what you were alluding to when you were talking about looking at, you know, British leftist publications. And I'm just wondering if you see sort of particular eras or differences or kind of things that resist Soviet narratives or challenge them. Obviously, the Soviet propaganda model was well funded and could, you know, produce publications in a way that independent organizations might struggle to. But I'm wondering whether, I was just sort of thinking as you were talking about, would it have been impossible for the left to come up with a critique without the kind of, if I might borrow the terminology of a Soviet hidden hand, as it were? That was my one question.
A critique of Zionism and a critique
yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to ask about was in Russia today, what you see in terms of you know, the same kind of efforts to present viewpoints now reflecting the position of the Russian Federation rather than, and how much there's similarities or differences or whatever. Sorry, so two complicated questions at the same time.
I may need you to repeat the second question because I'm already sort of thinking about the answer to the first one. On the first one, you're absolutely correct, of course, and I would never say that all of the left embraces it. In fact, it's only portions of the left, and even on the left that probably would have considered itself communist, you have arguments for sure that the propaganda that's coming out of the USSR is squarely anti-Semitic, and they don't want to be any part, they want to take any part of it. And what's interesting is that actually, for example, the Jewish Currents, and I've looked at only some of it from those years, I haven't looked at all of it, but you see in the 70s how they reject all of this Zionology. They identify it, and I say it's interesting because today, of course, the Jewish Currents are on the, kind of, I would say, on the leading edge of perhaps using, I don't know, but anyway, they seemed to me less radical in the 70s than they are today, to be honest with you. They criticize people like Yevseyev, they criticize all these other Zionologists, but they also criticize Israel and Zionism, in their own way. So yes, it's absolutely possible, 100%. And of course, there are left-wing intellectuals, the new left, who are criticizing Israel and Zionism in their own terms. So yes, 100%. So I'm really mostly just interested in the transmission of this specific rhetoric and who took it up, how did it become available in the various languages around the world. So yes, it's the well-funded publications, communist publications, and they're not only communist, they're also, the Soviets were funding something like 80 different parties around the world. They were not only communists, there were other workers' parties, and if they produced publications, they would have carried the Soviet line. But yes, the answer is absolutely, there was critique. And by the way, in the 1980s, I think in 82, 83, a really excellent book came out, which some people may be familiar with. It's Funny You Don't Look Anti-Semitic, by Steve Cohen, where he is a socialist and he's an anti-Zionist. He's British, and he criticizes what he sees some of his fellow leftists publish in the UK on the very same terms. He says, look who you are aligning with. It's horrible. You're dragging down the whole movement. There are other ways to criticize Zionism and Israel. And recently a critique came out by a really excellent critique on the same kind of, following the same line of argument. I don't remember the name, unfortunately, and the title of the book, but he follows in Steve Cohen's footsteps. And he says, the language that we see today on the far left is just really horrible for the left. Now, tell me again, what is it that you were asking about contemporary Russia?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, and actually semi-relates to one of the questions that's come up in the chat, what you see, or whether you see any kind of continuity or difference with the sort of messaging in terms of anti-Zionism that comes out, since 1991. And the question in the chat is maybe more general. Would you comment on how Putin's view of Ukraine as Nazist shows the same sort of false equation? That's related.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting about Russia is that once the USSR falls apart, all of this propaganda stops. It stops because there's no more funding for it, and it no longer fulfills any kind of foreign policy interests. In fact, as soon as it falls apart, the diplomatic relations with Israel are restored, and it's now in Russia's interest to have a good relationship with Israel. A million Soviet Jews go to Israel, and so for a long time, Russia does not engage in this kind of propaganda. What's interesting, and I alluded to it before, the people who produce this propaganda now are free to move to where they really belong. They no longer have to pretend that they're on the left and that they love communist ideas. So they just move to the far right. Already during Perestroika, you have the emergence of just purely anti-Semitic movements, such as Pamyat and Otechество, some people may know them. And they bring with them this very literature that they produced for the global left, right? They bring it with them to the right, and it works there just really, really well as well. And what's interesting is that David Duke, for example, has traveled to Russia several times. And at one point, he comes there and he quotes, he actually says that he really appreciates the fact that the Russian people understand the danger of Zionism. And why does he say that? It's because, you know, in the West, I think we separate. It's like the far right mostly talks about Jews and the far left talks about Zionists. But in Russia, they talk about both. They understand that both are, they understand that it's all the same. So all of that is kind of contained in these, you know, in the far right kind of corners, the Russian neo-Nazis and all that, who, by the way, play a very important role in the global extremist movement, right-wing movement. But the state did not engage with it until October 7th. So it did not engage in the kind of these anti-Zionist, anti-Israel tropes until October 7th rolls around. And on October 7th, again, like foreign priorities shift. And now it's no longer useful for Putin to be aligned with Israel. He is, of course, now fully isolated, and he sees the October 7th as an opportunity to come out of his isolation. And he now begins to use, Russia now begins to use these anti-Israel tropes that it used to use before. Now, I don't think that they are necessarily the biggest and most important player in the sphere, specifically in this kind of anti-Zionist propaganda that, you know, the way they used to be in the 60s and 70s. But we have others use the same language. So we have other, you know, Deborah Lipstadt has been talking a lot lately about how anti-Semitism is a favorite tool of authoritarian regimes because it allows them, it becomes a stirring spoon with which they can stir existing kind of prejudices and existing disagreements and create chaos. And so we see today China using this language, and it may have used it in the past, but I don't think, I mean, I'm not a China expert, but people say that it's new for China to be using these tropes. So, okay, so that's that. Putin's propaganda about Ukraine being Nazis. So that's also not necessarily new. So, you know, remember the Soviets didn't only fight Zionism. I mean, they found there were several nationalisms that they found dangerous. So Zionism was one of them, and the other one, pretty much equal to that, was Ukrainian nationalism. And they view it as so dangerous because, in fact, they had to fight Ukrainian nationalism, you know, for several years after the World War II. And of course, there was absolutely Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis. There were certain groups, paramilitary groups that collaborated with the Nazis. But Ukrainians are also most insistent. You know, they're just resentful of Soviet influence. And so a lot of times, you know, when you talk to refuseniks, they will talk about having spent time, those refuseniks who ended up being prisoners of Zion, right, who ended up sitting in the Gulag, spending years in the Gulag for their Zionist convictions and activism, they were often in the same barracks as Ukrainian nationalists. So Ukrainians already back then too were compared to Nazis. And today, I mean, look, today it's just, again, it's like it's the only way. You know, I look at it again from the kind of policy perspective or propaganda perspective. I think it's the only way for Putin to communicate to his people that Ukrainians are evil. Because why do you call somebody a Nazi? You call them to communicate to them that these are evil people. They need to be eradicated. They need to be eliminated. And with the memory of World War II, I mean, the memory of World War II is a really important and crucial part of Russian collective memory on various levels, national, personal, family, grassroots. So I think that he just viewed it as the best motivator to convince people to go and fight. He didn't have any other arguments.
Another interesting question from the chat. Did Jewish samizdat play a significant role in changing the narrative, I guess the Soviet anti-Zionist narrative? Was there a pushback from other underground publications? I'm assuming within the Soviet Union.
Pushback in which regard?
I'm guessing against the Soviet anti-Zionist narrative.
I see. Okay. So the Jewish Samizdat played an important role. I think the interesting thing about Jews in the USSR is that they did not engage in the question of, is it anti-Semitic? Is this anti-Zionism? Is it anti-Semitic or not? They understood it right away, under those circumstances. They knew the impact of the rhetoric. They knew how it was used, how it was manipulated. It wasn't an issue. They knew it was anti-Semitic. So I don't think that was really a point of discussion. What Jewish Samizdat really focused on was on the building of Jewish identity, because that was so crucial for Soviet Jews who had been so assimilated, who wanted to understand, okay, if I'm discriminated against as a Jew, but what does it mean? I speak Russian, I love the Russian language, I read Russian literature, I love Russian literature. So why am I not, what's wrong with me, right? Why am I a Jew? What does it mean? So a lot of Jewish Samizdat was engaged in that. They would republish various writings by Zionist writers, like Jabotinsky was very popular, the Exodus was extremely popular, and the exploration of identity, and just really teaching each other, teaching Hebrew, teaching the history of the Jewish people, really the very basics. Were there other Samizdat publications that pushed on Soviet anti-Zionism? Yes, absolutely. The dissidents they were called the Democrats. So they were ones who wanted to reform the Soviet system to be more democratic. They absolutely stood with the Jewish struggle. They understood that the Soviet system was anti-Semitic, and they very much, people like Andrei Sakharov very much supported the Jewish refuseniks. He's a big hero to Natan Sharansky. So yes, for sure.
Question sort of bringing things up to the contemporary moment and potentially contemporary politics. From the chat, can you talk a little bit about the similarities between the Soviet anti-Zionist committee and the, quote, as a Jew, quote, crowd that we are now seeing, especially among the Hollywood elites?
That's a really good question. So the anti-Zionist Committee of the Soviet Public is a committee that the KGB organized in the early 80s, I think in 83 or 84. And they organized it specifically to get Jewish public figures to say all these anti-Zionist things, because they understood that the anti-Zionist ideas land much better when they're spoken by Jews, and it frees. It's like it disarms those who might say that this propaganda is anti-Semitic. Now, it wasn't the first time that they did it. I mean, they already started doing it in the 70s, using Jewish public figures for these purposes. So, in fact, I would say that they're kind of the biggest kind of the first public wave of anti-Zionist campaign begins with a March 5th, 1970, I guess, media event where really well-known Soviet cultural figures like Arkady Raikin, for those who know, an actor, a comedian, Maya Plisetskaya, a very well-known ballerina, are put on stage and are made to mouth these anti-Zionist dogmas and condemn Israel. So, how is it similar to the As a Jew movement today? I mean, look, I think that there are similarities in a way, except that these people were certainly, they were forced to do it. They were actually they had to do it. They had to do it if they wanted to. They knew that their careers, their success, their opportunity to continue doing, their ability to continue doing what they were doing, and they all loved their professions, and they were beloved for their professions, depended on their ability to perform these services for the authorities. And this wasn't, the Anti-Zionist Committee of the Soviet Republic wasn't the only time that Jewish figures were called upon to do something for the regime. It was a regular occurrence. Today's, as a Jew, Jews, nobody forces them formally, but you could say that perhaps the social pressure is very strong. So, it's interesting. One of the really interesting things for me about the current moment is that, and it's not only with regards to Jews, it's more broadly, is how certain authoritarian trends, or let's say self-censorship, right, limits on speech, can become entrenched in a society, even in the absence of a regime specific, right, of a government authority that does it from above. It's just somehow in the presence of a certain strong kind of social pressures, it can act in very similar ways. The Soviet Jews who were part of that committee, this is already the vegetarian times, right? It's not Stalin's times. So would they have been even put in the Gulag? They certainly didn't face executions. I would say they probably didn't even face going to the Gulag or to prison. But they would have, they might have lost things professionally. So, it's not, sometimes people say, well, Soviet Jews were really they were forced through state pressure. I would say that those Jews they could have followed their conscience if they wanted to, but they chose not to. So this, it's complicated. I think there are similarities, there are differences, but I think it's a very legitimate and a very interesting question. I think it requires a nuanced kind of answer.
There's a question that just came in, and you sort of began to talk about it in your talk, but we'll ask it again, and we've still got, I think, what, I can't count, 13 minutes?
Yeah.
Something like that, if my math is correct. Looking forward with a long-term view and with a historical background, what are the 1 to 2 most effective ways, you can go to 3 if you want, for Jewish people collectively to resist anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Look, I take my cues here, I have to say, from the Refuseniks movement, because I think that the first thing we need to do is to look internally at how do we conceive of our identity, how do we conceive of our relationship, between diaspora and Israel. How do we, what do we value? What are we committed to? I think that the work has to start from the inside, I have to say, before we can fight this from the outside. There are certain things that we need to do. I think there's some soul searching that needs to happen internally. And this is where I would start. This is where I would start. I don't know if I can really even go into more details, but until we internally are strengthened, I think it's hard to fight this coming from the outside.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if anyone else has any more questions. Otherwise, we can give people back 10 minutes of the potential time. But happy to.
Let me actually add something else. I think that in terms of education, I think it's really important that we actually do some learning about the different aspects of anti-Semitism, the way it shows up on different parts of the political spectrum, because I think that we've made a mistake, a strategic mistake, by focusing all of our attention on right-wing anti-Semitism. And I think that, speaking at the Shoah Foundation, I'm aware of perhaps this sounding controversial, but I think that the Holocaust education alone does not help us understand how anti-Semitism grows and how it operates on the left, because I think it operates differently on the left. The ultimate results may be similar in that Jews experience anti-Semitism, but the dynamics are different. And I think part of our problem today is that so many people are confused. They don't understand that when they're told that this is not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism, people don't know what to say. They're confused. There's some people today say, well, anti-Zionism is criticism of Israel. But it's not. Criticism of Israel is criticism of Israel. Anti-Zionism actually tells us something else today. Anti-Zionism says that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. So there's a lot of untangling of this very complex and convoluted terminology that we need to do. Again, this field has been the playground of various intelligence services, right? Propaganda agencies by state actors, activists, and there is a lot of confusion. And I think that we need to dedicate ourselves to understanding anti-Semitism specifically on the left. And along with that, I think we really need to teach ourselves at least a little bit of Soviet history, because I think most people, most American Jews understand Nazi German history, right, and the anti-Semitic dynamics there. People really, truly, I mean, the level of knowledge about the USSR is just very, very low. And I think it, you know, it's the other side of the totalitarian story of the 20th century. So I think it's really important.
Thank you for that. We had a flurry of questions, but they seem to be mainly in relation to what you were talking about, which was kind of current, educational efforts and what we might do. And the last one was, what do you think is a proper response to current anti-Semitism since October the 7th? I don't know if you want to talk about that more. You began to get into that.
Well, I mean, I really, I hate to say it, like, I wish I had a quick answer. I wish I could say that we can just do one thing right and then everything will be solved. People say, well, Israel needs to improve its PR effort. Why hasn't Israel improved its PR effort? I mean, Israel, I'm sure, can improve its PR effort. There's no question about it. But expecting that it will solve all the problems it's a little bit like asking, well, why haven't we Jews succeeded at improving our public image? Why haven't we? Why is there still anti-Semitic propaganda? Why do people still believe in anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? And I think the reason is that, we stand against a very it's very uneven, right? Let's put it that way. The conspiracy theory is elaborate, and so we have to set the expectations properly. I think that it's a long-term effort. I don't have quick solutions. Maybe somebody else does. The people who are now in the streets, protesting not just against Israel, but really for Hamas, they've been educated. I mean, I think that it's a generational effort. I think that they're expressing something that they've learned over the course of their entire lifetimes, many of them. And so I think it's a question of the educational system. I think we need to approach it from a very kind of serious and global perspective. Again, we're in a war of ideas, as I said before, and that's how we need to look at it. I don't think there will be quick solutions. I think we need to do, so we're all in, like, I'm engaged online in debunking myths and lies. I think a lot of us do that. We need to be doing that in our lives every day. But right now, this is just swapping at the flies one by one. I think we need to be thinking on a more fundamental strategic level.
And thank you. And I want to echo some of the thanks and comments that came in. There are a number of people. Oh, where have the comments gone? But we're just wanting to say thank you. And what a great presentation it was. I don't have the exact quotes, but there were several comments that came in to that effect. So wanted to
Thank you very much.
thank you, and for everyone who attended and had questions, for making this an really engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye then.